time to join, and maybe Leather.
Ooh, you're going to have to tell me how this works, Joe.
Well, I think we're now live.
Yeah.
Just give me a thumbs up. Okay. We'll just give folk a little bit of time to join. This is going out on Facebook and on Twitter and on YouTube, which is on our website as well. So hopefully we've got a big audience from around the world. It's one of the good things about these times, isn't it? This might have taken place in real time in a real place in Edinburgh, but actually we get to be all around the world, which is great. So I'll just give folk a little bit of time to join us, and then I'll make a few introductions to everybody. How are we doing? Great. Okay. Let me start by saying a little bit about the context. Firstly, welcome to everyone who's joining us, wherever you may be. The context for this symposium is that we, Dunedin Consort, tomorrow have a concert called Nature's Voice, which is themed all around music, music inspired by nature. And actually it started out as a collaboration with the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, who's as part of their 350th anniversary celebrations this year. We were due to have a big gala concert in collaboration with the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh as part of those celebrations, and sadly COVID has sort of curtailed those somewhat, but nevertheless we're still putting on that concert tomorrow as an online broadcast, which will be on Facebook and on YouTube and on Dunedin Consort's website. Anyway, but programming, the opportunity to kind of program a concert themed by nature sort of gave us the chance to think more broadly about our own contribution to the climate change crisis, and what we are doing now and what we can do in the future, and what the rest of the sector is doing more broadly to tackle it, basically. So that's why we're all here tonight. I'm delighted to welcome all of you and looking forward to hearing your kind of insights on this. Dunedin Consort recently adopted a new environmental policy, which is on our website, and that's been a big kind of step change for us to really think in really practical and concrete terms about the little things and the big things that we can do. And it's everything from kind of reducing plastic in the rehearsal room to the way we tour and programming, in fact. And you know, this is a prime example that we're programming with the environment in mind, which is kind of the first time that we've done something like this. So I'm hoping that this evening we might come away, all of us, with some really practical tips about how we can make changes in our own work and sort of set up best practice elsewhere in the sector. So may I start by introducing or asking each of you to introduce yourselves. I see that Simon's just disappeared from the screen, but hopefully he's going to come back. So let's start. Ben, would you like to say who you are and what you do?
I will. I have to say I'm getting a terrible echo. I'm hearing everything 2 or 3 times.
Oh. Is anybody else?
I just heard you there introducing me.
Oh.
I'm now hearing myself speak. So I'll begin by saying I'm Ben Twist. I'm the director of Creative Carbon Scotland, which is a charity working across Scotland on the intersection between climate change and the arts. And I come from the arts myself. I'm the chair of Hebrides Ensemble, and but I've spent most of my working life as a theatre director. But I've more recently become qualified, shall I say, in climate change. I did an MSc in carbon management. And Creative Carbon Scotland works on 2 fronts, really. We work with the cultural sector, helping cultural organisations reduce their carbon emissions and start thinking about adapting to climate change. And then we work with the non-cultural sector, climate change organisations, people like the Botanic Gardens, applying cultural practices within those areas on climate change projects. So there might be a filmmaker working with a committee looking at decoupling carbon emissions from economic growth, or it might be somebody working in the Outer Hebrides on looking at marine protected areas and how we can bring the ideas of climate change, but also community management of protected areas into the fore. So applying cultural practices and employing artists to work in that way. The final thing I suppose we do is we work with what I call structural organizations, those that create the structures within which the arts work. So we help them develop their frameworks to make sure this is applied across the board. So that's probably enough from me.
It's quite a broad and very important remit, Ben. I suppose some people elsewhere in the UK might know about Julia's bicycle, which is not dissimilar in scheme, and maybe we might even talk about that a little bit later. Thanks, Ben. Maybe I could come to Mark next. Mark, would you like to tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Hello, I'm Mark Pemberton. I'm director of the Association of British Orchestras, which is the representative body for professional youth orchestras and professional and youth orchestras across the UK. And we have a very enthusiastic grouping of Scottish members who keep me on my toes. And our role is connecting, championing and developing orchestras across the UK to keep them world leading and absolutely at the top of their game. And
you do a very good job at that, Mark, may I say.
You've been looking after you silver-tongued flatterer, you.
You've been looking after us very well through these difficult times as well, I must say, and doing a lot of championing on our behalf. And yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Simon, would you like to tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Yes. Hello. Good evening, everybody. I'm Simon Milne. I have the wonderful title of Regis Keeper of the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, but in day-to-day money, that's Chief Executive, I suppose. Forgive me, I got a bit of a croaky voice, but hopefully you can hear me all right. Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, one of the world's great botanic gardens. It's there with an amazing plant collection, one of the finest plant collections in the world. Herbarium for 3 million specimens in the herbarium, and lots of visitors. But essentially we're there for research into plants, underpinning conservation programs, education programs from nursery all the way up to PhDs, and engagement, lots of engagement with the public. Of course, with the beauty of plants and how plants are so amazing, but also to inspire the public to take action in conservation, to understand what's behind climate change and the role that plants play in that. And a lot of that's actually through the arts. So we've got a very big arts program there, which is growing every year. We published a new arts manifesto last year, which is really using the arts to amplify our mission. And it seems to go down very well. So that's Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Simon. And as I say, we were really sad to see that our collaboration concert not happen as planned this year, but it's really nice to be uniting with you on this anyway. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the Botanic Garden does behind the scenes, if you like, as we go through this evening. Jenny, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yes, hi there. Really nice to be here with you all. My name's Jenny Jameson. I'm Chief Executive of Scottish Ensemble, another performing ensemble organisation based in Glasgow, but touring around Scotland, the UK and internationally, which I'm sure we will cover later. Our work covers concert giving, lots of cross-art form collaboration and collaboration with other disciplines outside the arts, and also education and engagement work too. I'm also on the board of the Association of British Orchestras, so work closely with Mark and chair the Scottish members' meetings. And the third thing I'd mention is that Scottish Ensemble recently founded the Bridge Network, which is a group of innovation-focused ensembles from across Europe, a project funded by Creative Europe to look at sector development and building best practice and sharing knowledge across those kind of innovative ensembles from around the continent. And one of the things we have talked a lot about in our recent Zoom meetings and while we're connected over the digital sphere is climate change, and is how different organisations across the continent are tackling that in the context of their programming, their international touring and the work that they present. So I can hopefully draw on that later.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons I invited you, Jenny, actually was just to get a picture of what other organisations are doing. I know very well what our organisation is doing and trying to do, but it's really interesting to hear what other colleagues in the sector are doing. So great to have you here. And Katy, hopefully a lot of Dunedin audience members who are tuning in this evening will recognise you, but do you want to tell everyone who you are?
Hello, yes, I'm Katy Bircher and I play principal flute in the Dunedin Consort, and I'm also a freelance musician, touring musician, and trying to work out how to achieve that in the least harmful way. So I'd be very interested in all the things which are said this evening, and trying to fathom how to go forward in this profession.
It's a challenge for us all, but I'm hoping we're going to come out with some kind of a few practical tips anyway by the end of this. Ben, may I come back or start with you? I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit about the sort of bigger picture. I mean, we all know that we're facing a climate crisis right now. We all need to know, we all know we need to do something about it. Can you give us a sense of just kind of how stark that challenge is, and you know, how soon we need to take action and how radical that action needs to be?
We need to take action yesterday, and it needs to be very radical. I thought I might give you a tiny bit of history. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the sort of global agreement on climate change, was actually formed, I think, after the Rio summit in 1992. So a long time ago. We've known about the issue for at least 28 years, and probably rather more than that, because the Rio summit was itself a response to concerns about these things. And we have had a long time when we have not taken enough action. And the UN framework has led to a series of events and things being set up, one of which is the climate change talks that take place every year, except 2020, and taking place next year in Glasgow, the COP26 as it's known. And these have been going on, as I say, for many years, and there's been a certain amount of progress and good things have happened. But I think perhaps the point to bring us up to date is in 2015, the Paris Agreement, as many people will know, 196 countries, I think it was, unanimously, or nearly unanimously signed up to the Paris Agreement. And in itself, I think it's worth bearing that in mind, because very seldom do 196 countries all sign up to something together, which is not only are they signing up, but they're also all agreeing to do things which are probably going to be detrimental to their economic growth and so on. So they all recognize the importance of this issue. And again, as people probably know, in the Paris Agreement, the countries all agreed for the first time ever to seek to limit temperature rise, global temperature rise to 2 degrees C, and ideally to get that to below 1.5 degrees C. And they've never agreed a specific target before, so that was quite a significant occasion in itself. And then even more significant, that was ratified by enough countries to make it come into force, which is how the UN frameworks work, very quickly, within, I think, about 6 months. Normally this takes a number of years. So again, the seriousness of the issue is really recognized by everyone, I think. However, the countries have all agreed to do certain things, but in order to reduce their carbon emissions, but what they've agreed to is nothing like enough to get us down to 2 degrees. It's actually, we're heading more to 3 or 4 degrees. And while that doesn't sound very much, I'm sure Simon will tell us later, 2 degrees makes for a very different way of life to what we have at the moment. 3 or 4 degrees, 4 degrees probably makes much of the planet unlivable in. So we've got a very serious issue to deal with. We've already, temperatures have risen by about one degree since industrial times, and they are not showing, with the exception of because of the pandemic, they're not showing any decreases. And there was a thing issued by the International Energy Authority today, I think, saying that they're very concerned that although there's been a dip in carbon emissions during the pandemic, it's likely that there'll be a rise immediately afterwards. So it is very serious. There is a lot going on. You'll have seen possibly in newspapers and the websites and so on recently that China has decided to limit its reach net zero by, I think, 2060. And there is a need for the globe, the whole globe, to reach net zero by 2050. China is a very big emitter. I should know this, but I'm pretty sure that the West, the developed world, needs to actually hit peak and start its emissions reducing from this year onwards. So we need to have got the maximum by now. So there's a lot of work to do. And I should just add in here, there's the other side of this, which is we talk about carbon reduction there. The other side of this is adaptation to the changes that the climate change is bringing. And we're all seeing this already. Scotland. We see it in California at the moment, and wildfires. We've seen it in Australia with wildfires and floods, and we're perhaps aware of the stuff that's going on in other parts of the world, but there's a sense that it's not really happening to us. But of course, actually, we've seen a lot of flooding in the UK. We've seen heat waves at very strange times. The winters are already warmer and wetter, and the summers are often warmer and drier. So things are changing, and they're changing around us. And things like The Beast from the East back in 2018, which I know led to the cancellation of a new music festival in Dublin, meant that these events are going to happen again more frequently, and they will affect arts organisations just as much as they affect everyone else. Mm-hmm. Just one last thing to say, I suppose, before we move on to others. The changes that we need to make are not simply technical changes, scientific, technological ones. They're also going to be, for both reasons of carbon reduction and adaptation to the impacts, they're going to be social and cultural changes. And I think, and we're seeing that really in the pandemic at the moment, that things are changing, the ways we do things, the way we think are changing even as we speak, really. And I think we're going to, well, I know that we need to think of climate change as having an effect on our society in that way, rather than just in a technological way. There is no silver bullet. There's no technical solution to this. We're going to have to change the things we do. So I hope that's a useful summary of where we are.
It's a very useful benchmark, Ben. Thank you. And maybe I might ask you later whether you think that the other crisis that we're facing right now, the global pandemic, has in a funny way thrown up some solutions or some ways for us to kind of refresh our working. But let's come back to that a little bit later. Simon, I wonder if you could follow up on what Ben has been saying by telling us a little bit about how the research that you do at the Botanics is helping to kind of feed into this, the research against the crisis, and also perhaps just give us a sense of the bigger picture in terms of biodiversity and not just, what it means to us as people, but the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think when most people are talking about or thinking about climate change, they're thinking about motor cars, aeroplanes, and the burning of fossil fuels in power stations. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it's, as I said before, it's inextricably linked with biodiversity loss. Plants are our basic life support systems. All known life depends on plants. The air we breathe, the medicines, absorbing CO2, etc., etc. We need plants, of course we do. The problem is that 2 out of 5 species of plants in the world are threatened with extinction, and we still have not described in science all the plants that exist. So we lose plants at our peril. Plants are very important in terms of mitigation of climate change, and also adaptation too. You put all those together and we've got a problem. Joe, you mentioned just now about the current pandemic, and that's really sort of brought home the interdependency between climate change, biodiversity, and human health. And excuse me, one of the reasons we have the pandemic is, of course, biodiversity loss is bringing animals close.
We're just losing you a little bit there, Simon.
The disease doesn't affect, and the more we lose biodiversity, and the more we lose through vice versa. I was going to give you some bad news and saying that the increase of and the loss of biodiversity. So I think it's critical to recognise the interdependencies of those 3 things. It's awful to bring this bad news in the evening, isn't it?
Sorry, I think we just lost Simon there. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi just let us down there. If I can I throw this question back to Ben? I know you've just spoken, Ben, but I want to start focusing on how this bigger picture, this wider climate picture, relates to the arts, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Creative Carbon Scotland does. For a lot of our listeners and audience members, it might not be immediately obvious what our work in the arts has to do with the climate crisis. You know, it'd be interesting to hear from you how you think we can influence work here or otherwise.
Sure, and I'll just start by saying I completely agree with what I gathered Simon was saying, that the climate crisis is interlinked with a whole series of other crises. There's one about soil loss, the biodiversity loss, and so on. And climate change is a big exacerbator of other issues, and that applies to human issues, equalities, and so on as well. So I think Simon's, I'm with him on that, and if I can help at all to fill in on that, I will. Yeah, so what I thought I'd do here is just take you down from the global right down to the Dunedin, if you like. And I mentioned the Paris Agreement, which is this United Nations framework, and that led to the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which they wrote this group of, it's a massive range of scientists all working together. It brings together the current science, and the report in 2018 demonstrated that it was possible to achieve a maximum 1.5 degree climate temperature gain, and that to move to 2 degrees would increase massively the loss, the human loss, the loss of land, and so on. And on the basis of that, the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is our committee that works for the UK government, recommended that it was possible to achieve to get to net zero carbon by 2045 for Scotland and 2050 for the whole of the UK. And so they said, right, we've got to cut out nearly all the carbon emissions, and I'll come to that in a moment, by 2045. And they reckoned that we needed to get to a 70% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and 90% by 2040. But not to be outdone, the Scottish government said, oh, we can do better than that. So in 2019, the climate change emissions reduction targets bill said, right, we'll do net zero carbon by 2045, fair enough, but we'll also go to 75% carbon reductions in Scotland by 2030 and 90% by 2040. Now, we've already got to about 45% by now, 42, I think was the target. But still, that was the easy bit in many ways, because what we've effectively done is we've decarbonized the electricity supply, which is a relatively few. We've closed down coal-fired power stations, we've built a lot of wind turbines and what have you. The harder thing is taking out the gas boilers from your flat and mine, and stopping us driving around in cars, and the agriculture and the land use that Simon's talking about. But the City of Edinburgh and City of Glasgow councils, not to be outdone by the Scottish government, said, we'll do even better than that. We're going to get to net zero by 2030. And they'll try by 2030, but they set themselves a soft target of 2037. So there are some pretty stretching targets there that some might say are impossible to achieve, but I know that certainly the City of Edinburgh Council is working pretty hard on things. So what is net zero carbon? Because I think this is how this is when it applies to cultural organizations. So it covers all the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, all those other things that we don't particularly need to know about. Very importantly for Scotland, but not for many other parts of the world, it includes domestic and international aviation and shipping. So those flights that orchestras take to far off parts become part of the carbon emissions that we have to worry about. And equally importantly, it cannot be achieved by international offsetting. And we might come to offsetting later, but offsetting is when I want to emit my carbon, I want to emit 100 tons of carbon. So I pay somebody else to reduce their carbon by 100 tons, and that gives me a clean conscience, and I don't need to worry about. What the Scottish government says, it cannot be done through international offsetting, but it can be done to some extent through domestic, local offsetting. And the plan acknowledges that Scotland has a great opportunity to plant lots of trees and reinstate peat bogs, which are very, very good, not only great havens of biodiversity, although they may not look it to the untrained eye, but also contain an awful lot of carbon. So we can use that to some extent to achieve net zero. So what this means for cultural organizations, I am getting there, is that we need to cut out basically all carbon emissions from fuel that we burn, whether in buildings or in vehicles that we own, lease or hire. We need to cut out all carbon emissions from electricity, which is more or less been done anyway. And then perhaps particularly important, we need to cut out carbon emissions from, in effect, our waste and so on, but also not only our supply chain, so those are the air tickets that we buy, but also the purchased goods and services, the use of sold products, as the frameworks have it, which I think includes the purchase of tickets. So we need to think about the emissions caused by people traveling to our concerts, because we have influence over them. We may not be able to control them, but we have influence over them. And what this means, I think, for cultural organizations is we need to think about capital planning, because we've got a lot of buildings that we need to consider refitting and sorting out with different ventilation and heating systems. And also we might need to be investing in those electric vehicles. We need to think about audience, business and touring travel, as you've already mentioned, which I think will lead to a question about business models. All those festivals all over the world, can they still exist in an era when international travel is going to become much more expensive? We need to think about communications, because there's things that you can talk about in terms of what you're doing and also why you're doing it, and work with your audiences and so on. And there's also program, and Scottish Ensemble of you've got an event tomorrow. Joe, Scottish Ensemble have worked with Aidan O'Rourke. There's people like Peter Maxwell Davies and Ket Farewell. A name I didn't know until I was looking it up earlier, Lei Liang. John Luther Adams. There are many classical composers who have been working on this, an increasing number at the moment. And then I just think there's COP26, which we might want to think about next year. There's opportunities there. So I hope that answers your question, Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for us at Dunedin Consort, travel is the big elephant in the room, if you like. I mean, we report our carbon emissions to Creative Carbon Scotland every year, which we have to do as part of our agreement with Creative Scotland. We're a regularly funded organisation, but of course also it's good practice to do that, because it forces us to scrutinise where our carbon output is coming from. And it's probably no surprise to anyone that 98% of it comes from travel, as much as that. Now, our output actually for the size of organisation is fairly modest, but 98% of that comes from travel. We are a touring organisation, as are most orchestras, and sometimes that's touring around Scotland, but it's also the UK and it's further afield. And of course, touring for us brings international renown, which brings increased prestige at home, which brings more concerts. You know, it's a circle that feeds itself. So how we can tour in a sustainable fashion is, I think, one of the biggest questions that we're facing. Mark, I wonder if I could, this is a good time to come over to you. You represent orchestras across the UK, many of whom tour regularly in normal times. This is this is a different time for us all at the moment. But I wonder what sort of changes you've seen the orchestral sector take in recent years, decades even, and whether that's for better or worse in terms of emissions, and also how you've started to see ensembles respond to the crisis that we're facing at the moment.
Okay, well, it's quite interesting that Ben took us all the way back to 1992, and that Simon mentioned the importance of plants, because in fact the ABO has actually had this as a topic for a long time, and it really started in 1993 when the ABO ran one of the first national music education projects, The Turn of the Tide, commissioning Peter Maxwell Davies to write a piece performed by school children across the country, which had as its focus what was then called the ecology. And we took an ecological view around our responsibility to stop wasting so much. Then I arrived at the ABO in 2008 and noticed that there really wasn't any focus at all on the environment. And so in 2009, I made it the focus of our national conference. And of course, we run a conference and people travel from all across the world to come to our conference, through which we contribute to carbon emissions.
A very good conference though, Mark.
Yes, thank you. But at least we did sit people down and say, we have to take this topic extremely seriously. And it was, as I say, the primary message from that under the title Sustain, that we had a moral responsibility to be more careful around what damage we might be causing the environment. And that led in 2010 to the publication, in collaboration with Julie's Bicycle and Orchestras Live, of the Green Orchestra's Guide. And also, Julie's Bicycle provided us with a mechanism for a toolkit for measuring emissions. And of course, that was then complemented by the amazing work that Creative Carbon Scotland has been doing. So we were getting ourselves motoring on this. That's a really bad analogy, to use the word motoring, on this as an issue. And then what happened? The global financial crash and a change at Westminster of government that brought in austerity. And I'm going to talk much more about England here, which brought in substantial cuts in public funding and forced orchestras to think enterprise, go forth and prosper. And it actually pushed orchestras to do more and more touring, because that pays the bills and enabled the orchestra to survive, as well as everything you talked about, Joe, around international renown and stuff. But we did end up feeding the beast by having to simply tour more and more and more. So I'm afraid the progress that we made, sort of the breaks was, we just forgot about it. And then when we suddenly realized that we really were genuinely in a climate emergency, we simply had to stop, pause and reset. It was back as my focus for the conference. I dusted off the Green Orchestra's Guide. I found that it was still, in concert with Julie's Bicycle, it was totally valid, bar a slight obsession with CD packaging. And that actually, we needed to reactivate this as a topic. And we had a conference session, and one of the orchestras we heard from was Sinfonia Lahti in Finland, which had declared itself a zero carbon orchestra. I'm afraid offsetting was part of that, as I understood it. And earlier this year, you may have heard about the tour by Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, who did a tour to Hungary and was it Czech Republic? No, Budapest. Budapest, and I can't remember where, Prague was it, by train. They did it all by train. And that meant that a 2.5-hour flight turned into a 24-hour journey at each end of the tour, plus traveling by train to the two cities between. And it was extremely expensive. But it was a massive statement of intent. And the one thing to bear in mind was the motivation for that came from the fact it's a self-governing orchestra, and it was the musicians who want to do this. And this is where Katy is going to be supremely relevant to this discussion, because touring is also very often pushed for by the musicians. They like going on tour. And we have to switch it to musicians wanting us to be greener, because they do very much often set our agenda. So there has to be a discussion around the responsibility of the management and the responsibility of the musicians as to how we jointly achieve this. And I think you talked about, is there a COVID dividend that's happening? I would say kind of yes. I mean, I've got to be careful, because I've got members who really want to get back on the road, who want to tour like they used to. They want the good times to return. But what we've seen through COVID is a localization. We're all going local in every country. Artists can't just jet in, perform or conduct and jet out again. Orchestras can't just say, do you know what, we can just go over there for a concert and come back, and then we go to another country and come back. It is serious thought is going to have to be given. But at the heart of that, it's going to have to be also questions about public subsidy. And that's a challenge for the Scottish government. If it wants you all to be green and more local, one of the quid pro quos is to offset the loss of income from touring through increase in subsidy. Because without that, I think there will always be that motivation to earn your living, and earnings come through touring. But I will finish by one positive statement, which is never forget that we are an acoustic art form played on recycled instruments. And the very fact of orchestras is in itself greener than our colleagues in commercial music, who can be highly energy intensive.
Thanks there, Mark. I'm going to come to Ben in a moment, but all the questions you raised there are precisely the things that we wrestle with on a daily basis. I am fortunate to have an orchestra who are very green-minded, and they want to tour in a green way, and we'll talk about that with Katy in a moment. What you said about expense is the biggest thing. I mean, it is expensive to travel by train, and probably people out there don't realise is that the longer you travel for, the more we pay the musicians for their time. Of course, if they spend an extra day travelling, you know, we have to pay them to do that. And we would love to be able to afford to do that, but the finances of this often don't stack up that way. And also exactly what you said about international touring, people may not realize, but it does often pay the bills. It often comes with fees that you can then plow back into your program at home. And if you take those international tours out of the pot, you're left with loss-making concerts in the UK and a balance sheet that doesn't work. So how we wrestle with all these competing agendas is really, really tricky. Ben, just before I go to Katy, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, just one question perhaps to Mark. The touring is also hard for certain sectors of the workforce. So people have caring responsibilities and so on, which often tends to be younger women. And I wonder, is there a division between those who want to tour? Is there an age division or a group of people who do want to tour internationally, and those perhaps who would rather be able to stay at home and not have to deal with the time away from home and children and what have you? Does that come into it at all?
I definitely say I see that to some extent, and that, you know, at the younger age of things, people just want to get on with it and do more, and, you know, you want to get a career and you want to be known and you want other people to invite you, and then perhaps the reflection comes a little bit later, as you say, when that career is established and you can maybe afford to take that step back, maybe, but also, yeah, as you say, competing demands from other things in your life. Katy, do you want to step in at that point? I mean, I know that you, because I know you personally, I know that you are quite conscientious about green things as well as many others, and I wonder how difficult you find it to reconcile being a touring musician with a wish to be environmentally conscious.
Yes, I think it is a very difficult balance to find. I would just say about touring and, you know, the fact that musicians love touring. We do, of course, and it's great to go to other places, and it's great to play in different halls and play for different audiences, and musicians historically have always travelled and gained so much from that. But actually, I think that what we really want to do is play the same programme more than once. And if the tour can give you that, that's what we want to do. And it doesn't have to be to Australia. If it was round Scotland and we got to play the same programme 5 times, we would love that. And I think that that's really maybe something that people don't appreciate fully, that's one of the reasons that a tour is so attractive to us. It sorts of ways. It's difficult to be offered work and have it fight with your principles. And I mean, maybe being offered a concert at the moment feels like a kind of mythical thing, but if we just go back to what we'll call a kind of more normal world, you're offered a concert, it's one concert in Spain. And of course, it's crazy to travel to Spain, but it's also our livelihood, and saying no to paid work is a difficult thing. So I think many people are now looking much more at this and trying to arrange their own travel. It means it very, very often can be done by train. It's possible. You have to be very organised. You have to be in touch with the organisation a long time in advance to plan. But, you know, these are things that we could do, which we can do. I think we also need to be looking at the way that concert tours are put together. And also things like festivals. It's a lovely idea that you could have a festival where, you know, 4 different orchestras from 4 different countries come and play 1 concert each. But actually, it would also be lovely to have 1 orchestra that goes to a festival and plays a whole range of concerts. We can maybe start looking at the fact that I believe that audiences would really enjoy that. They would enjoy forming a relationship with an orchestra and seeing them do a range of different things. And perhaps we can start thinking about how these things might be done, and we all need to just question it. And you know, the big tour to Japan or whatever, maybe 1 orchestra goes, not several orchestras doing, you know, concerts in the same place. And then the next year, if, I mean, it seems that, you know, tours to Japan maybe they're over, but if they're not, then I think we really have to look for all these orchestras to be zipping around the world. We need to form a dialogue between orchestras and try to see how we can positively manage the work in a less destructive manner.
I think that point about collaboration is really important, Katie, and it's collaboration across all parts of the sector. It's collaboration between organisations to link up and make sure we're not duplicating unnecessarily, but also between promoters. I mean, we would love to go to Spain for 7 concerts, not 1. I mean, there is no orchestra out there who wouldn't want to do that. What we find is that either, you know, one festival wants an exclusive and the festival down the road doesn't want it because it's getting performed somewhere else, or they just don't talk to one another, or the dates are at different times of the year, and trying to join up the dots is sometimes a promoter's nightmare. One of our, we just had a comment come in from someone who's watching this, Johnny McMurtry from Glasgow, and he says, if anything good is to come out of this pandemic, and that's a big if, so Simon Rattle said that the future for arts will be connecting with local audiences, hence less air travel. And he asked if the panel have any thoughts on this. I mean, Katie, I think that's precisely what you were alluding to, you know, the sort of connection with local audiences within UK, within Scotland, you know, on our doorstep. Is something that, well, it's been forced on us at the moment, but I wonder if in the long term it will have longer term ramifications and cause us to rethink the way that we program and the way that we structure our schedules. Jenny, can I throw it over to you as someone who sort of, I feel like you connect all the different dots here. You're like me, you're a programmer and a promoter, so you're in charge of some musicians, but you also promote your own concerts and you deal with festivals across the world and venues. How do you reconcile all these competing demands?
Yeah, well, I think something Katie just said really resonated with me, in you described the conflict of being offered work and how that can conflict with personal principles and decision making, and I certainly feel that in my role too. You know, the joy of being offered an international performance by a promoter in a venue across the world who's connected with your work and with the art and the music that you've made is a really positive thing. And I think I hope that, you know, none of us would say we would want to reduce or devalue the importance of international collaboration. And in fact, just now with a shared global challenge, perhaps it's even more important. So when an offer comes in like that, of course, you're thinking, okay, there's potential income here for this, or for our organization. There's potential, as you said, profile, reputation building, connection building, cultural diplomacy value. And those are all things that as a leader of an organization, I need to value. But I think what I'm increasingly trying to ensure is that the environmental impact, the climate impact, is one of those absolute top level levers that we have and consider, and when we're deciding whether or not to take on international work. And I think that pressure, or that decision to think about those different levers in that way, is both internal but also external. So many people have mentioned in this conversation that external frameworks, funders, government initiatives, etc., often have a slight inbuilt conflict too, in that people and funders desire international touring as a means of cultural diplomacy, but also there is a pressure for organisations to become greener. So for me, when I'm thinking about those levers and the decision making around what international touring feels to balance them effectively, one thing I'm increasingly trying to do is to ask myself, is this particular touring project that we're thinking about taking abroad essentially something that only we, Scottish Ensemble, can offer? Or is it something that can be delivered almost as well, or certainly replicated and reinterpreted by a more local organisation? And of course, I think that's really interesting in classical music, because you can definitely argue that no two interpretations of a symphony or a concerto are the same, and that there is an inherent identity and personality and message to be shared with each one of those. But I really believe it's becoming increasingly important, if not absolutely imperative, to ensure that when you travel abroad, you're offering an international audience something new, a cultural experience that they will not have access to without your orchestra traveling. Now, of course, we should definitely at some point talk about the opportunity to share that digitally rather than physically taking it across the world. But given how much we all crave live performance just now, and how much I think we appreciate and revalue the human connection that brings, and the thing you can't get across a Zoom screen, if we are thinking about keeping international touring of some description as part of what we do, for me, that's a really important question about making sure you take a product that you know the orchestra down the road from that promoter can't deliver. And the second thing I'd kind of highlight from my programming perspective in my role is that, and Ben, several people have touched on this actually, I think as arts organisations, we have a huge opportunity to use emotion to inspire people to think about the climate crisis. I think we can create artistic storytelling, and in many ways that's our most powerful tool, stronger than many big operational statements, which are often have internal impact, but in terms of external impact and impact on audiences and thought and behaviours, I think we need to really hone and harness the fact that if we program about music like you're doing this week, about nature or climate change like you're doing this week, Joe, I think we can make people feel the urgency and feel the trauma. And then when you get that emotional connection, you're more likely to see a lasting impact within individuals. And we also have the ability to reinforce that through how people connect with what we do. We all put on events, and if you put on regular events, there's a sense of habit on both the part of the organisation and the part of the audience. And if we can start to positively influence audience habits and how they interact with the arts and how they think about their carbon, as you've talked about, Ben, as audience members, I think that also has to play into our operational planning more and more as we go forward.
That's really interesting. I mean, one of the things I was reading on Julia's Bicycle's website earlier was that they think that the creative community is uniquely placed to influence people, to influence the rest of the sector and to influence audiences. And precisely because, as you say, we stir emotions and we do something that is collective, and we can bring people together in a way that a lot of other sectors can't. I'm quite interested to get Ben's viewpoint on that, but also I'd love to come back to Mark as well about how viable you think it is. Jenny was saying some really interesting things about looking at whether you are the best organisation to take that tour, and sometimes that's a difficult decision for an organisation to make, especially right now when it's it's a famine out there and anything you can get, you're going to go for it. But I'll come back to that in a minute, Mark. Ben, maybe you could talk, just pick up the conversation about the creative community as sort of uniquely placed to influence people.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and I would agree with Jenny. And one of the things that we say at Creative Carbon Scotland is that culture has an essential role to play in the transition to a sustainable society. But I want to widen it from just the role of emotion, because I think there's something very interesting about the business of all those people coming together to sit tightly packed together in a single room. Because
the heady days of that, Ben.
The heady days of that. And this perhaps comes more from my theatre world, but I think there's something very interesting about, if you imagine a venue provides a place deliberate place, or maybe an event, an outdoor event or whatever, but a deliberate place that the community comes together to think together and share together. And then when you put it on a Tuesday evening at 7:30, the organization provides a specific time that then the audience give up. They say, right, I'm going to allocate that time to sit with other people and think together and share. And then the material that you put on, whether it be Aidan O'Rourke or John Luther Adams or whoever it might be, provides material to think about. And your players and your conductors and what have you also provide a structure, and they provide something that helps people think productively. And I think there are no other ways, no other arenas really in society where we're provided with that specific time, place, material, and help to do that thinking. And that's particularly the case in theatre, which has the narrative form, but I have no doubt that it happens also with music. And I think that's an equally important part of it. And just that business of sharing together and thinking together is what is going to solve the problem, I think. And it happens in galleries, happens at the Botanics and so on in other ways, but I think that business of people all sitting down together at the same time is absolutely crucial.
Simon, would you like to come in there and talk a little bit about the engagement work that you do and pick up on what?
Yeah, I would actually. I mean, everything that Ben said there certainly resonates with us. I think some of our most successful artistic performances and exhibitions are those which have been linked to the environment. And when you have that synergy between the backdrop of the botanics and the creative side, it works brilliantly because people get all their senses going because they're in amongst the plants or the trees or the birds or whatever it's going to be. So we have looked again at our whole creative program. And I think in the past it's been a little bit haphazard in the sense that we've had some great performances, great exhibitions, no doubt about that. But it wasn't as well tied up with our mission in terms of biodiversity, research, science, that it might be. And we found that putting together a whole group of the arts community with scientists and others really started to get that program going and to create something that was actually very special indeed. And I think, well, you'd have seen the start of that in our 350th year, and part of it was going to be that concept that we were going to do, what you were going to do, Joe. But I think exploring those synergies out with theatres is important as well. I think that's a great thing to do, and broadens the audience.
Mark, are you seeing these kind of ideas being picked up across the sector with other organisations? Are you seeing these kind of collaborations like the one that Simon's talking about here being picked up by other ensembles and other music organisations?
Well, I think we've always been collaborative. I think orchestras have always sought out partners, and I've always felt that there is a world outside the bubble of orchestras from where there can be useful connections. So yeah, I think that it's quite common to see those sorts of initiatives happen. You're going to pin me down now to say name one.
No, I'm not. What do you make of Jenny's point earlier about when orchestras are offered tours, really scrutinising whether they are the best place to deliver that?
Yeah.
How do you feel that would resonate across the orchestras that you represent?
Well, I think but that was what we started with back in 2009 and 2010 when we put together a group of orchestras and artist managers and concert halls and the sort of classical music business to say, are we doing things the right way? And we said the very first word you start with is planning. It's all down to making those sensible planning decisions. I was a bit shocked, as an example, there was a proms quite a few years ago when Singapore Symphony flew over for one concert and flew back. That's the sort of behavior that strikes me as unsustainable. But if we could just bring the festivals, the venues, the orchestras, the artists all together to have a grown-up conversation, which is what we did a decade ago, and we made progress. And it was a shame that sort of just was dissipated. I think that then can bring everybody on side to say there is a better way.
Mm-hmm. Of course, sometimes we find that Jenny will probably know this too. You get offered a concert and you think, great, I'll try and build a tour around that, and you start trying to build a tour around it, and maybe even get to the point where you've got a tour, and then some of the pieces fall apart, and you're left with one or two concerts, and then you have to make the gut-wrenching decision: do you fulfill your obligation to those promoters that you put left, or do you pull the tour entirely and therefore lose the work for the musicians? And this kind of careful balancing act sometimes is so difficult to get right.
I should also, though, stress that you did manage to find a very interesting alternative transport option only recently of using fishing boat.
We did. I mean, but that highlights just how, I mean, the fact that we went in the first place was because there had been no work for months and months and months. And I mean, we couldn't not go because there was no guarantee that we were going to get stuck. And if I had cancelled that performance and then there hadn't been a quarantine and my musicians, you know, I'd taken that work away from them, it just sort of highlights sometimes you find yourselves in these difficult positions where you have to go with it. I should say that it was a very green tour because we went by train and we didn't fly, and then we came back by boat, as you know, so it can be done. I'm going to come to Jenny, but first I'm going to come to Ben, who would like to cut in there.
Yeah, just I spoke earlier on about our work with what I call structuring organisations, the funders and so on, that, and to some extent the government, that set the framework within which we all work. And I think it's really important we need to work with them as well as the artists, the orchestras, the planners, the venues, and so on, because I've been talking to theatre companies a lot, and they tell me that they would rather not tour internationally, but as you said earlier, Joe, it's the only way they can make the books balance, which is about the system that we're working within. And actually, if it is unprofitable to be a theatre company or a music group in music ensemble in the UK, there's a problem right at the top of the tree saying, why is this the case? And if it's not sustainable in that way, so we've got to work with all those people all through the system. And only when I think we get all those people in the discussion will it make sense. And that, of course, I think also may well include the audience at the far end of it. So that's all I wanted to say there.
Absolutely. Jenny, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, Joe, I just wanted to pick up on your point. So absolutely have been in that situation of a beautiful tour that's well rooted, is all mapped out, and then a couple of pieces fall out and you have to make that decision all over again. And I just wanted to say that I think conversations like this and trying to make sure that the sector's sharing responsibility. So for me, the OAE example that Mark raised earlier around them taking the decision to go to Europe by train, taking a financial hit, is a really great call to action. But of course, one organisation can't sustain that approach because they'll crumble financially over time. And for me, there's a really important lobbying work to be done with presenters, with agents, with people who are selling the tours and planning the tours, to try and reach some sort of shared responsibility around making those decisions, both in terms of whether tours go ahead, but also how they're logistically planned. So we've talked a lot internally about trying to at least offer and start a conversation about, this is the cost of a tour when it's sustainably planned, and this is the cost of the tour when it essentially isn't, or when we're taking shortcuts effectively. And I think that's obviously more work for organisations to come up with multiple models for one potential outcome. But I think trying to start those sorts of conversations with the people presenting the work and taking the work across the globe is one step that people like us, running organisations like ours, who do have some international touring ambitions, could consider. And I certainly know that ensembles that I've connected with across the globe are thinking about similar kind of dual models. And I mean, even raising that conversation and starting that conversation, I think automatically raises the visibility, and also raises that question of who is responsible. Are we talking about extra funding like Ben referenced earlier? Do we need to lobby at government level? Should the promoter that's taking an ensemble from Scotland be paying the difference to make sure it's sustainable? Should both companies invest? Should the audience have a say in that? Should they say, we want this festival to be green and we're willing to pay higher ticket prices, for example, to make that possible? I think it's our responsibility to raise the visibility of the question is also very urgent.
I think that's absolutely right, Jenny. We have a responsibility to keep saying it until the message sort of hits home with all sectors. I was having a conversation with somebody today who was saying that, you know, he knows of an orchestra, I think it was in Sweden, who will say that the conductor and the musicians have to come by train. And if they don't come by train, they don't get the gig. And you're just firm about that. And we now have a policy. We won't fly people up from down the UK, from London or wherever. You have to take the train. Unless there's, you know, really serious extenuating circumstances, because you can do it by train, and therefore you should, and that message has to keep being got across until it starts to take an effect, and it just becomes the norm, doesn't it? So a lot of these things take a while to become the norm. Ben, can I ask about offsetting, because we're talking quite a lot about touring, and I would like to talk about some of the sort of smaller practical day-to-day things, but before we move away from touring, can we talk about offsetting and why I think you alluded it to into your introduction, why it's not good enough, because for some organisations, I think they would say, well, we have to tour, so the only thing we can do is offset. So why not?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. For a start, as I said earlier, it actually doesn't fit into the legislation. So whilst it might be a short-term option in Scotland, it really isn't a long-term option. That's not the case for the rest of the UK. In England, offsetting is permitted, I think, but Scotland has a very clear thing about that. And the issue with offsetting is, at the moment, most offsets are sold massively cheaply, so you're not actually doing the getting what you get, not offsetting. You're not paying. You're not making enough problem for yourself by offsetting. To make it realistic. And there's lots of questions about what tends to happen is that trees get planted or forests get protected, and there's questions then about the longevity of that forest and whether it really is protected and so on. So there's all sorts of rather technical things. Within Scotland, that's perhaps easier to manage, but one of the difficulties is that there's an issue of double counting, where the question is whether that land would be planted or the bog would be reinstated anyway. And at the moment, there isn't an inventory of all the land which is already being sort of set aside, if you like, for offsetting at a national scale, as the government has offsetting plans, which you can say we're adding to that. So the legislation and the sort of the guidance is really clear that we have to get to basically zero carbon in all sectors except for agriculture, some heavy industry and aviation. And those are the areas which will be offset by the national government. And it's easy to settle upon offsetting as the card, the get out of jail free card, but it doesn't actually work, and it certainly won't work in the long term. So I think we need to start making the changes, the cultural changes, the changes to the system that we've been talking about, rather than just put off the problem for another few years, and then it'll come back and bite us on the bum in future.
We've had a really interesting question from David Kettle, who asks, and this sort of follows up on all the conversations we've had about collaboration and wouldn't it be nice if, and he says, to what extent do current funding arrangements and the necessity for entrepreneurialism encourage a market or competitive environment that hinders the cooperation needed for difficult decisions about touring and local playing? That's a big question, isn't it? Mark, what do you think?
That's a genius question. Look, orchestras are competitive. They always have been. We mask that competition in a kind of collaborative spirit, but actually, yeah, of course, there is a competition. And if you think you're going to bag that festival spot against another orchestra, you're going to chase it. And as I said, you're right about there is the issue of the public money. In diminishing public money, we obviously have to chase more private money, which can militate against the greener practice that we want. Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution. I merely reiterated the question, but I'm saying, yes, it is absolutely true. That we often talk in our world, don't we, about a business model. And it's a business model predicated on losing money on every concert. And that is, and many people don't understand that that's actually what the challenge that you and Jenny live with every day of running an orchestra. It costs more to put on the concert than you can get straightforward from ticket income. So you get pushed to make money in other ways. And that can compromise, as I say, that what you want to achieve. But it's a reality of where we are in a sort of, where we are, you are a business that needs to survive, but equally with the motivation of providing work for your musicians.
Is this a UK thing? You know, are other countries getting it right? Are other countries actually able to sustain a business model that doesn't require this kind of crazy touring?
I think that it's what I've always thought is quite interesting is how little known French orchestras are. They're very good, but they're very local because they are so well funded that they don't have that imperative to tour. And it is, so there does come down to a certain amount of, and actually, if you look at the States, most orchestras in the States don't leave their city. They stay rooted in their city, and they are therefore the audience in that city. There is something about the mixed economy model we have in the UK, which is we'll give you some subsidy, but you have to also earn and you have to fundraise, which pushes and prods much more into this entrepreneurial get out there and earn a living. So fun enough, the American model of lots and lots of donors pay you to just exist and to be a local resource, or the continental European and Asian model of have lots of government subsidy, does actually, and it makes it easier to stay where you are.
Yes. I mean, we all have to stay where we are at the moment, don't we? And I wonder how that has affected the sort of long-term trajectory. But actually sticking on the what we can learn from other countries. Simon, I wonder if you might come back in and just sort of to move away from the touring question and just to thinking about biodiversity and thinking about sustainability, and are there things that we can learn from other cultures and other countries in this respect, you know, quite aside from the touring question, just in terms of how our handling of climate change?
Yeah, there's good examples and bad examples. I think the answer actually lies in partnerships, working together. That's what we do. I mean, we're working with 34 countries around the world on our research. And it's actually pulling those ideas that makes a big difference. But there's some good examples. I mean, if you take Singapore, now Singapore was being hammered then, I think, for traveling. When you look at urban biodiversity and the greening of urban areas, which is critical to our health and indeed mitigation of climate change, adaptation, Singapore is a very good example of that, of greening their city. So that's one example. And there are other examples in Denmark and in Sweden and even in China in some places. But it's about partnerships. That's the thing. It's about working together. We've all got something different to offer. In our plant collection comes from most countries in the world. We have species from most countries of the world. We're just the custodians of that collection on behalf of the world. So we see ourselves very much as a global operation working in partnership. And we don't think about individual countries quite so much. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the answer I'm giving anyway.
No, it does, and I think there's a danger when we're talking about how touring is the enemy to sort of to turn away from internationalism and collaboration. And I think all of us that is vital to the way we work. It's what fuels the creativity in our sector. It's what makes your work at Botanic Gardens as important as it is. Jenny, you might have something to say in this regard, and maybe even if you might talk about the bridge a little bit. Simon, sorry, did you want to say something before I leave you?
Just come in there, Joe. I just want to give you a slightly better feeling. We're all in this together. I mean, we do travel a lot. We use a lot of, or quite a few aeroplane flights because we are exporting our expertise. People coming over here, so we are grappling with the same issues. The way we get around it is going to places for longer and in a region and doing it. So you're away for longer, which has obviously impacts on individuals. But that's certainly what we're planning, and then making better use of the technology and doing less conferences face to face. Now that obviously doesn't apply to your world, but I just wanted to reassure you that we do have the same problem. So although we're trying to up policies for climate change and addressing biodiversity loss, we in a small way are also contributing to that through our travel, and it's a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel your pain, because I think we're all in a position where none of us is willing to sort of put the walls up and just stay put, because it would remove so much that is good about the work that we do, and I think that probably speaks to all of us. So there has to be a way of doing it that is sustainable and environmentally conscious. Jenny, did you want to say something?
Yes, just to pick up again on David Kettle's question, and also this question of continuing international collaboration. I think one of the positives for me of the current situation is that actually international dialogue, certainly within my work, has increased and has become more essential and more regular. And I suppose reflecting on COVID as a global disaster that we're all dealing with, one can definitely imagine that the next thing of that ilk would be a climate disaster, a very immediate global climate issue. And I think that therefore the question about rivalry and whether that's a barrier needs to be broken down and tackled more actively, because actually if we're in a position where that is the dominant force, or one of the dominant forces, then we're backing ourselves into a corner, because we are going to be more globally connected in tackling the bigger things, I think, going forward. And I suppose in a related point, and to come back to your question about the bridge, Joe, we did get to a point in one of our network discussions, and we're in a position where we were supposed to have our first live interaction in May. So I've never met many of my bridge peers in person, and we've built the relationship through the digital sphere. But we did get to a point where we said, look, is this a conversation to be had? We all know each other, we know the territories we work in. Should we be saying, yes, we could come and do that concert, but actually there are 3-4 organisations closer to home that could get to you by train? And it is a very difficult thing to do, because as Mark says, you always want to jump on that opportunity and make the most of your touring potential. But I think we've not really talked too much about whether small steps or radical change is where we need to focus just now. And I kind of feel like the pace of change is increasing so quickly and accelerating so dramatically that more radical change is going to need to happen quicker. And for me, abolishing some of the rivalry factor might help in that regard.
I think there's also never been, COVID has been a weird blessing in a way, in that we would never have had time to think about this question before, because you're sort of on the treadmill of doing. And from the conversations I'm having with other people in the sector, other colleagues, for once we actually do have a little bit of moment to pause and think about this. And as you say, to be able to talk with people across the UK and across the world more than ever before. I feel more connected to the international community than ever before, and even though I can't be there, and it does show that actually it is possible. It's exactly what you're saying there.
And Joe, sorry, just to say, I also think it shows that change can happen quickly. When we're absolutely forced to, we can change the cycles and the structures that we've been tied to for many years. And classical music is definitely guilty of not being able to break from long-term planning cycles. And I think the responsiveness that we've all had to show in changing business models and means of connecting with audiences now proves that when really forced, we can do it. And therefore, should we be thinking about that flexibility, that fleet of foot ability to change in the context of the climate crisis?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think it has proved that we are adaptable. When we didn't think we were, it's proved that we actually are. I wonder what any of you think actually about to what extent you think that what we're going through right now will have a long-term impact on the way we work. And if you think, is digital a good thing? I mean, I'm very conscious that we can reach people across the world without leaving our doorstep, but we're using server farms everywhere, and goodness knows what else. I mean, Ben, maybe you have a point to make on that, and maybe that also connects with the small things. We haven't really talked. We've talked about the bigger picture and the collaborations that we'd all love to see happen. But what about the small steps that we can take on a sort of daily basis? What are the sort of things that you advocate to arts organisations?
We've talked about some of them in terms of looking at your travel, and we too, Creative Carbon Scotland, we're part of an EU project, and we all travel overland, and it takes longer, and it's quite fun and interesting, but it does take a long time. It doesn't need to be quite so expensive, but it often is, and it's doing things efficiently. A lot of it is actually about reducing waste. One thing perhaps I would say, sort of going back a little bit, is Jenny mentioned the are we the best people to do that performance or whatever. There's other, and you mentioned, Joe, the need for international collaboration. Sometimes I think, yes, there is, we don't want to be parochial and so on, but also we need to know that those gigs are the essential ones. Are we really going to get something out of it? Or are we just flying there to do a gig, come back, not see the place we're in, not have any relationship with the audience? And there's one performance in Spain and then on your way home again. I question whether that's, and I've toured myself, whether that's has the same impact, or whether there are others that might be more pertinent and more useful. And I think this is something that might come out of the pandemic. And I should say that the pandemic is not going to go away next year, is it? We're going to be living with this one way or another, even if it's only the economic fallout for the next 4 or 5 years. So it is definitely going to have a long-term impact on us. But I do think that it may make us value the local more. And I don't think being local needs to be parochial. And I think there's an interesting challenge for us as artists and thinkers in the arts about how you make sure that you're not inward looking, whilst also being very focused on your audience and actually helping that audience see further than its doorstep, if you like. So I think that may be something useful that we all need to think about on our individual front, but also organizationally and sectorally, to come out of this pandemic, thinking about what value there is in the local and how we can make use of that, rather than think we always have to be away. And I'm sure this applies. There are questions around this, and it's not easy. I'm sure that applies, Simon, in research and academe and so on. And these questions are really big and difficult ones, but I think there may be something to come out of it.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I know that Mark needs to go, so I'm going to thank Mark and bid him good night. Mark, thanks for being part of this.
I do need to scoot off now.
Not at all. Thank you for being part of it. I have a couple of other questions that have come in that I would like to just focus on before we move towards wrapping up. A question from the AGAR Trust, who, if any of you don't know, are a wonderful organisation based in Scotland who try to support musicians in rural areas. They say, our interest at the AGAR Trust is families in rural Scotland and the opportunities available for youngsters to see live performances. While there have been many wonderful innovations this year providing accessible performances and tuition online, we would be very concerned if the opportunity for youngsters to see performing groups live were to disappear in favour of performing in urban areas. And of course, this is all about the question of staying local. We're aware that travel in rural Scotland is an expensive option, both in terms of financial and environmental cost. Do the panel have any sustainable solutions? Jenny, you do quite a lot of touring around remote areas of Scotland, don't you? How do you make that work?
Yes, we do. I would say, I would come back to Ben's point about relationship development with your audiences. So for us, we've focused on, I would say, around three areas, more rural areas, and built that over time. And I think it is impossible for our audience to reach for our orchestra, to reach every rural audience member in Scotland, of course. But we've kind of tried to look for gaps in the sector, for areas that aren't covered by our larger orchestral peers, and started to develop ongoing multi-year relationships. And actually, I think that feeds again to Ben's point on the international front. Why not pick 1 or 2 countries that you return to, build a relationship with over time, and the impact for that audience, the connection goes much, I would argue, probably much higher. And so I would say that that's a model that can have resonance both at home and abroad. I mean, I think, just to come back to a point you made also, Joe, around COVID and around the long-term benefit or learning that might come from it. I do think there's something around digital which while it can never replicate the live, I think we all need to embrace the access opportunities that it does create. And we've got our first schools performance at the end of the month, which we're hoping, you know, we can advertise to every school in Scotland, which is never something we've been able to achieve in our touring year. So for me, there's a balance. You can never replicate the feeling of being in a room with a live musician, but there are ways to increase awareness, to increase understanding, to increase interest and passion for it through other models and other formats online. I don't know if that directly answered the question, but it's certainly, I guess it's around balance for me.
Thank you. Actually, Katy, I wonder if I could ask you how you feel. I mean, you've sort of dipped your toe in the water of digital performances, or, you know, performances that are for online only now. We recorded something at the weekend that's going out tomorrow. If this is the future, or if it's at least the new normal, and I don't like that phrase for now, how does that feel as a musician to be delivering things that, you know, are only going out online and, you know, don't have an audience in the room, or a tiny audience in the room?
Well, it's a necessary thing. And actually just being able to perform with colleagues is a tremendous, wonderful, life-affirming thing, which we have had to do without. So at the moment, I'm still kind of giddy with just having got together in a room with my colleagues and made music. And I think it's fantastic that it will go out to a wide and varied audience. I don't think that can replace live concerts. I think there are things you miss. I'm also, just being a parent of young children, I just think yet more things on a screen is not really what we want to be promoting. So if it's alongside, then I think of course it has value, but I'm kind of wary of the idea that this is great, this is how concerts could be. Look, it could be in your living room, you could be doing the cooking while you're, you know, or you could be, you know, doing things on 5 other devices while you're watching concert. And I would love to just for people to remember how it is in a room in that collective way and share something. So I'm still a huge advocate for live performances.
Yeah, aren't we all? Just to come back also to the question, I think I know what the answer is going to be, Katy, but we were talking about the idea of touring where you are there for longer, and so I'm not necessarily talking about a tour where you do 4 dates in one city, but how do you feel as a musician about being embedded in a community for a number of days? I know Jenny and I, for example, coming back to this question about rural Scotland, have had conversations with promoters in various parts of rural Scotland where they're really keen actually to have us there for a few days, to work in schools, to do some workshops, to do other kind of community engagement, maybe to do a recording while we're there, you know, not just come in and out for one concert. Does that make a difference to your experience as a musician, being able to work in that way?
Sorry, I just lost you at the end, but I think I know what you're asking. I think that would be wonderful. I can't see any reasons not to do that. Being away from home, of course, is, you know, that presents challenges, but being away from home in community, I think it is incredibly attractive.
Oh, we're just losing Katy there. Oh.
For all health, I mean, you're schlepping around. Oh, am I?
So
I don't
we
think
just
I am.
lost you.
I was just saying that, you know.
You're back. No, okay. Let's come over to Jenny. Jenny, okay. You were going to say something.
So yeah, just to touch on that point, the kind of residency model where you base yourself in one place. I think from my experience talking to both my musicians and our audiences, the impact of that can often increase for both sides. So from our musicians' perspective, they feel like they've got a more direct personal relationship with the audience. They probably meet them in settings that are less formal. So as well as performing a main concert, if we still think of the main concert as a 7:30 platform, concert hall platform, they also interact with audiences in schools, in community centres, out on the street. And I think you feel that trust between audience and performer, you feel the connection grow, and therefore I would argue that the impact increases. And I think audiences, and also loyalty from audiences, we've seen evidence that would back that up from their perspective too.
Well, it's definitely something that we would like to do more of, and so any promoters out there who are listening, please invite us for a few days and not just for one 7:30 concert. Just before we wrap up, I have one more question that applies to all panel members. Just give me a moment. It's from Stuart McRae, who many of you will know is a wonderful Scottish composer. He says, can the panelists name one work of art of any type, so I guess it could be of any art, that has inspired or moved them to think differently about our responsibility to the environment? Who am I going to come to first? I'm going to go to Ben.
I always find this really difficult because I can't, I have to confess. And well, that's perhaps what's pretty true. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. I'm not sure it's a work of art, but it's certainly made me think differently. But I think there are few that do that in quite that way. It tends to be not specifically about the environment for me. That's made works that have made me feel differently. So there's been political works and others. So I'm not sure I've got a good answer to Stuart. Sorry, Stuart.
Okay, Jenny.
Yeah, I've got two. So at the very, very early in lockdown, one of the first things I bought a full price ticket to go and see online was a play called Lungs, which was put on by the Old Vic. A two-man play created in socially distant conditions, and it featured a young couple grappling with the environmental impact of deciding to have a child. And for me, I guess it was a combination of COVID, feeling connected with a live piece of theatre, the subject matter and the wider relevance that it had just now that really certainly made me think. And the second one I would highlight is actually, I confess, something a colleague shared with me this week, which is a project called High Waterline, a visual arts project. It started in New York and has now been delivered in cities across the world, where essentially people mark out or draw the future water lines within cities, so where we'll see the impact of ice caps melting and sea levels rising, and it shows the physical change that our land will undergo, and I think it predicts where water is going to be in 15 years time, and it's really, it has participating elements. Communities can on board and do it in their own home city, and it is terrifying, frankly.
Wow, I have to check that one out.
You can check it out on our website.
Oh, great! We'll post the link to that below the meeting. Simon, did you have any examples of art that's made you think differently about the environment? You're on mute. Let me ask you to unmute.
I've got one from the past and one from for the future. Actually, from the past was Pianodrome. I don't know whether anybody saw that in the garden. So upcycling old pianos, which were destined for landfill, essentially, made that into an auditorium. Built into the auditorium were 4 pianos, so not only were there performances there, but people could come and play there during the day in the Botanics. And that, again, it's that synergy between recycling, being environmentally friendly within a natural environment. Super. And upcoming is our Inverleith Gallery is being turned into Climate House. And that's going to have a number of artists who will be producing works of art related to the natural environment and climate change. So that's a direct link between the two. So all very exciting.
Fantastic. Can people find details about that on the Botanics website?
Yes, they can. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they're on the website. Yeah.
Great. What about Katy? I mean, actually, you were playing, Katy, the other day, you were playing a beautiful piece of art all about nature. Are there any other pieces of art that have inspired you to think differently about the environment? Oh, Katie's frozen. Oh no, we'll never find out what Katie thought. Well, from my part, I wanted to mention.
Yes, the works of Buxtehude. Oh no!
There you go. No, we can hear you. We can hear you again.
Oh no!
Go on. Go on. Oh no, we've lost her.
You can hear me. I was just going to say. Oh no, this is tantalising. I was going to say the works of Buxtehude, because Bach took a long journey on foot. He walked him, which is a very green model.
That's wonderful, isn't it? Very fitting for Dunedin. Yeah, and I was going to mention Dunedin Consorts. It's very sort of inward-looking, isn't it? But we did a fantastic project with Cryptic last year and the Botanic Garden, so it kind of links up lots of nice things called Below the Blanket, and that was highlighting well, the devastation of the peat bogs, in fact, which brings us back full circle to the beginning of the conversation. Isn't that great? And we had some singers situated in the Botanic Garden singing under a tree. It was just beautiful.
Oh, yes.
We sang 4 times across the festival live, and we also recorded it. And we didn't get rained on once, which is astonishing in Edinburgh in August.
It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Simon. Well, we loved it. This ties everything up very neatly. Just remains for me to thank you all very much for being part of the discussion this evening. I don't know whether we've created any practical tips, but we have thought quite a lot about the way that the sector can work together. And I hope that anyone who's kind of engaged with this conversation this evening goes away thinking a little bit more about how we can all work together to tackle the climate crisis. Anyone who's available tomorrow evening, please do join us on YouTube, on Facebook, and on our website for our stream performance of Nature's Voice, in which the wonderful Katy Bircher features alongside Rowan Pierce. It's a programme inspired in many ways by the natural world. There's a bit of the Valdez Autumn, a beautiful cantata by Scarlatti, some Telemann water music, concerto about frogs, lots of lovely natural sounds. I hope everyone enjoys it. It's available for 30 days if you can't join us tomorrow night. It's free, and we'd love you to join us. So thanks everyone for being a part of it, and have a lovely evening, and see you all very soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Jo.
Bye-bye.
Bye.